My cousins found my aunt and uncle dead today, and I was the first responder. This morning, I was getting my motorcycle ready for the unusually great weather when I got a call from one of my cousins. Now I instantly found this odd because if I ever hear from them I get a call from my aunt. I answer and my youngest cousin from that part of the family is 6, the older brother is 8. He's freaking out asking if I can explain CPR to them. I told them to call the police and that I'd be over in 5 minutes. I speed over and they're both outside crying and screaming. Thankfully the neighbors had them and told me that both the parents were inside on the floor. I am blood related to my aunt, by the way. My uncle was married into the family. Now I have a lot of experience with dealing with traumatic sites. I was in the infantry with tenure. I've not only seen some messed up stuff, I've caused some messed up stuff. In that job you get a lot of medical training because we're the nurses for the medic when he's kinda busy. So we're trained fairly well. So I run into the house. The house was unnervingly still as I stood at the doorway, my eyes scanning the room. The air felt thick, as though the very walls were holding their breath in anticipation of something terrible. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of floorboards beneath my boots, but there was no warmth to the sounds. No life. Nothing to counterbalance the gut-wrenching silence that had settled in the space. As I crossed the threshold into the living room, my breath caught in my throat. The scene in front of me was like something from a nightmare. It didn't feel real. I had seen death before, plenty of it, but not like this. Not in this context, not in this place. Not to my own family. My aunt lay motionless on the floor, the violence of her death leaving her unrecognizable. Her head had been shattered, torn apart by a single cruel blow. The grotesque nature of her death made it almost impossible to comprehend. The woman who had always been so full of life, so warm and nurturing, was gone in an instant, her body an empty shell. I wanted to look away but I couldn't. My mind, trained to process such things, refused to let me turn off the scene. I needed to see it, needed to understand it, even if that understanding made my stomach churn. Beside her, my uncle was lying in a similar state, his head barely intact. The self-inflicted wound was evident. He had chosen the same weapon, likely in the same fit of rage that drove him to take my aunt's life. But what struck me the most was the fact that he had done this with his children in the next room. They had been asleep, unaware of the hell that was unfolding in their own home. I wondered as I stared at the lifeless body of a man I had known for years, how someone could go to such lengths to destroy a life, and a family. My mind raced through every possible explanation, but none seemed to justify the senseless violence that had been unleashed here. I stood frozen in place for a moment, my mind struggling to make sense of it all. The soldier inside me, the one who had been trained to compartmentalize, fought to take control. I pushed the emotions aside, focusing on the task at hand. But even with all my training, nothing could have prepared me for this. My body moved mechanically as I stepped further into the room, my gaze constantly flicking back to my aunt's body. I wanted to make sure my cousins were safe. I had to keep moving. I had to be strong for them. But it was hard. So hard. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me, suffocating any attempts to process the emotions. I could still hear the cries of my cousins in the background, echoing in my mind. I had to get to them. I had to be their rock, even if I didn't know how to be that for myself right now. I turned to the doorway where I could see the shadows of the officers entering, their footsteps muted on the carpet as they crossed the threshold. They too were struck by the magnitude of the scene. One of the officers threw up almost immediately, unable to control the reaction his body had to the sight. The others hesitated, their faces pale, their eyes wide with disbelief. I didn't need to speak. The image had already hit them like a tidal wave. It was as if the weight of the world had just been thrust upon their shoulders, and for a moment, we all stood there, frozen in the reality of the situation. "It's bad," I managed to say, my voice strained as I tried to maintain composure. I felt the distance growing between my emotions and my actions. A woman, no head. "It's a murder-suicide." The officers nodded grimly. They were professionals, but even the most seasoned of them would never be fully prepared for something like this. It was one thing to see violence in the field, to witness chaos on a battlefield, but it was another thing entirely to see it in the context of family. To realize that this wasn't just another statistic. This was personal. This was my blood, my family. This was a woman I had known, a woman who had been there for me when I needed support. And now she was gone, taken in the most brutal way possible. I stepped back, giving the officers space to do their work. I wanted to stay to help in any way I could, but part of me was already pulling away. My military training kicked in. Focus on the task, focus on the next step, focus on what needs to be done. But I couldn't escape the image of her body, the finality of it all. I couldn't escape the shock that rippled through me like a wave crashing against the shore, overwhelming everything in its path. The officers began to cordon off the area, carefully processing the scene. I watched from the doorway, feeling like an outsider in my own life. It was as though I was looking at everything from a distance, detached, as if the shock of it all had put me in some kind of mental limbo. I was there, but I wasn't. I was functioning on autopilot, running through the motions, but nothing felt real. I didn't know how long I stood there, but when I finally turned to leave, the weight of the moment seemed to press down on me even more. My legs felt like they might give out, my hands were shaking, and my chest ached with an unfamiliar emptiness. I could hear my cousins outside, still crying, still calling for help, but I couldn't bring myself to rush back to them just yet. I needed to collect myself, to pull it all together, even if only for a moment. I stepped outside, trying to push the horror of the house out of my mind. The neighbors were still with my cousins, holding them close, trying to offer comfort in the face of an unimaginable loss. The children's sobs echoed in my mind, but I couldn't process it. I had to be strong for them. I had to be the one they could look to for guidance and stability, even when my own world was crumbling. I glanced back at the house one last time before I approached my cousins. The officers were still inside, working to secure this scene. But for me, the image of my aunt, broken, lifeless, was already seared into my mind. It would never leave me. I would never be able to forget the way she looked, the violence that had ended her life. But there was no time to dwell on that now. My cousins needed me. They needed stability. And for their sake, I would find a way to hold it together. For their sake, I would become the man I had trained to be. Chapter 3. The Backstory. The moment I stepped outside, my mind was still trapped in the house, replaying the images I had just witnessed over and over again. But the world outside was different, quieter, as if the whole neighborhood had been touched by the tragedy. My cousins were huddled together, clinging to one another as the neighbors tried to comfort them. The kids' faces were pale and streaked with tears, their small bodies trembling with the weight of what they had just experienced. I couldn't help but think about the years of memories that would never leave their minds. The horror of seeing their mother lifeless on the floor would haunt them forever. As I watched them, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. I knew I had to be strong for them, to shield them from the confusion and heartbreak that would inevitably come. But part of me couldn't help but wonder, how had things gotten to this point? How had the family I once knew become a backdrop for such a brutal tragedy? I thought back to the times when my aunt had been a constant presence in my life. Her laughter, her warmth, the way she could always find a way to make everything better, even when life seemed impossible. She had always been the backbone of our family, a strong, loving woman who had endured more than anyone should ever have to. And yet, somehow, none of us had seen the storm brewing just beneath the surface. My aunt and uncle had met years ago, at a time when life had been full of possibility. She was young, vibrant, and hopeful, and he seemed like the perfect match for her. At least that's how it had looked on the outside. My aunt had always been the kind of person who wanted to see the best in people, to believe that everyone had a chance to change. She had fallen for him quickly, swept up in the romance of it all, eager to build a life together. In the early years, things had been good. They had gotten married, bought a house, and started their family. There were moments of happiness, of genuine connection, when it seemed like they might build a life full of love. But it didn't take long for cracks to start appearing. The signs were subtle at first, little things that most people would brush off. My uncle was quick to anger, often snapping at my aunt over small things. He was distant, withdrawn, and his temper flared when he didn't get his way. But she always tried to make excuses for him. She convinced herself that he was just going through a phase, that things would get better if she just gave him time. But the cracks grew deeper with every passing year. By the time their first son was born, things had already started to unravel. My aunt tried to protect her child, to shield him from the tension that had settled in their home like a dark cloud. But the violence had already begun, subtle at first, an angry outburst here, a harsh word there. It wasn't long before the emotional abuse became physical. My uncle would lash out at her in ways that left scars both on her body and on her soul. But she kept it hidden, buried deep within, refusing to let anyone see the truth of what was happening behind closed doors. I remember the day she confided in me. It was years later, after her second child had been born. I had noticed the change in her, the way her smile no longer reached her eyes, the way her laughter had faded into silence. She seemed distant, always on edge, as if she was waiting for something to go wrong. I had asked her about it, gently, hoping she would open up. And she did. The words spilled out like a dam that had finally broken. She told me about the bruises, the things he had said to her when no one else was around, the nights spent in fear, praying he wouldn't hurt her again. I was shocked, horrified, and angry. How could someone I had known, someone who had once been so full of life, become a victim in this way? How could my uncle, who I had known for years, become the kind of man who would hurt the person he was supposed to love? She tried to explain it, to make sense of it in her own way. She told me that he had always been charming in the beginning, always so loving, so caring. But once they were married, once they had children, his true nature had begun to emerge. The man she had married had become a stranger, a man who had lost control, a man who was incapable of love. And yet, even in the face of all the abuse, she kept holding on, kept believing that things would get better. She had always been so hopeful, so determined to fix what was broken, to save her family. But she couldn't fix him. She couldn't fix what had been broken for so long. By the time she had made the decision to leave him, the abuse had reached a breaking point. She had reached out for help, finally realizing that she couldn't protect her children from him any longer. She was terrified, terrified for herself, terrified for her kids, terrified of what he might do when he realized she was serious. She told me that she was done, that she had made up her mind to leave him, to start over. But even as she said those words, I could hear the fear in her voice. She knew what he was capable of. She knew what he might do if he thought he was losing her. But she had to go. She had no other choice. I didn't know at the time how bad things had gotten. I didn't know that her decision to leave would set in motion the events that would lead to her death. But in hindsight, it all seemed so clear. The anger, the resentment, the powerlessness he must have felt. He couldn't stand the idea of losing her, and so, in his twisted mind, he took matters into his own hands. He couldn't control her, but he could control the end. And so he did. The night he killed her, he took her life with his own hands. And then, in an act of cowardice, he ended his own. But the part that broke me the most, the part that I couldn't wrap my mind around, was that he had done it with their children in the next room, asleep, unaware of the nightmare unfolding just a few feet away. I thought about all of this as I sat with my cousins, trying to comfort them in their grief, trying to make sense of a world that no longer made sense. How could anyone do this? How could a man destroy the woman he had promised to love, destroy the mother of his children? And how could he do it with no regard for the innocent lives he was leaving behind? I didn't have the answers. I don't think anyone ever will. But what I did know as I sat there with my cousins, was that we would have to pick up the pieces. We would have to help them understand, help them heal. And most of all, we would have to ensure that they never felt the same weight of fear, the same helplessness, that their mother had felt. We owed her that much. We owed her the chance to have her children grow up free from the same kind of pain she had suffered for so long. The days that followed the tragedy felt like a blur, each one blending into the next, as if time itself had slowed down in the wake of the horrific events. I had never expected that I would be thrust into the role of a caretaker for my cousins. Never imagined I would find myself in this position. But here I was, trying to keep my head above water while carrying the weight of a grief I wasn't sure I could even begin to process. In the hours immediately after my aunt and uncle's bodies had been removed from the house, everything seemed chaotic. The police had their questions, the investigation had started, and family members began to gather. My cousins, 8 and 6, were still in shock. They couldn't fully comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened, but I could see it in their eyes. Their innocence was forever shattered. I didn't know what to tell them. I didn't have the answers. I couldn't explain why their father had done this, why he had destroyed everything they had ever known, or why their mother was never coming home again. But I had to say something even if it wasn't enough. I had to be the rock they needed even when I was barely holding it together myself. The funeral was one of the hardest things I've ever had to face. It wasn't just the sadness of losing my aunt, it was the overwhelming weight of knowing how her life had ended. The image of her lifeless body haunted me, and I could see it reflected in the eyes of everyone who attended. There were whispers, the shock of it all still settling in like a heavy fog. How could something like this happen to a family so well known in the community? How could a man take the life of the woman he had promised to love? I saw the way people looked at me, my family, my friends, as if I held some kind of answer to their unspoken questions. But I didn't. I didn't have the answers and I didn't know how to find them. All I knew was that my cousins were now orphans, left to carry the burden of a tragedy that no child should ever have to bear. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of legalities and paperwork, things I didn't even know where to begin with. My cousins needed a guardian, and I was the closest family member, the one who had stepped in when things fell apart. But even that felt like too much. How could I fill the shoes of a parent? How could I take on the responsibility of raising them when my own emotional state was in turmoil? The weight of it all felt suffocating. I had been trained for battle, for survival, but this was something different. This wasn't a fight with enemies. This was a battle within myself. I had to figure out how to be present for my cousins, how to help them heal, all while trying to figure out how to heal myself. I would spend hours with them just sitting quietly trying to make them feel safe. We didn't always talk about what had happened. Sometimes I think they didn't know how to bring it up. I didn't want to force them into a conversation they weren't ready for. But I could see the questions in their eyes, the unspoken confusion, the hurt that ran deeper than they could understand. They didn't know why their dad had done this, why he had taken their mother's life and then his own. All they knew was that their world had shattered and there was no going back. I had to step in and make decisions for them, decisions they couldn't possibly understand at that age. It wasn't just about protecting them from the truth, it was about helping them navigate a world that had suddenly become dangerous and unpredictable. I made arrangements for them to see a therapist, someone who could help them work through their grief, even if they were too young to fully grasp what they were feeling. I tried to keep their routines as normal as possible. School, playdates, family visits, anything to keep them grounded, to give them something familiar in the chaos. But even as I took on the role of caretaker, I knew that there was only so much I could do. I couldn't bring their mother back, couldn't undo the trauma they had experienced. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't fix it. And that realization was a crushing one. In the midst of all of this, I found myself reliving the past, thinking about everything that had led up to this point. My mind would drift back to the early years of my aunt and uncle's marriage, the times when everything seemed so perfect. I thought about how much they had loved each other at first, how they had built a life together, only for it to disintegrate into something dark and ugly. It wasn't just my aunt's death that haunted me, it was the lost potential, the lives that could have been lived differently if things had turned out another way. If my uncle had gotten help. If my aunt had left sooner. If I had been more aware of the signs. But hindsight was always cruel, and it didn't change the fact that we were here now, in the aftermath of something no one could have predicted. I had spent my whole life learning how to fight, how to survive, how to navigate the chaos of war. But this was something different. This wasn't something you could fight with physical strength or tactical skill. This was a fight for the future, for the lives of two innocent children who had been thrown into a nightmare they didn't deserve. I would sit with them at night, talking about small things, anything to keep their minds off the pain. We would watch cartoons, eat junk food, and pretend for a while that everything was okay. But I knew better. And so did they. The emptiness in their eyes told me everything I needed to know. But despite it all, I couldn't give up. For my aunt, for my cousins, for the memory of the woman she had been before everything went so wrong, I couldn't give up. I would keep going, keep trying to be the one who held it all together, even if my own heart was breaking. The days after the funeral had passed in a haze, each one indistinguishable from the last. Time felt like it had stopped, and in some ways I felt like I was just going through the motions. I woke up each morning, went through the motions of getting the kids ready for school, making meals, and pretending like everything was fine. But nothing was fine. It never would be again. My cousins, still so young, so fragile, were carrying a weight no child should ever have to carry. Their world had been ripped apart in the blink of an eye, and I was the one left to pick up the pieces. I was the one who had to try and rebuild something for them, even though I felt like I was drowning myself. It was strange how quickly life had changed. One day I was a soldier focused on the mission, on the job at hand. The next, I was a guardian responsible for 2 innocent lives. My military training had prepared me for combat, for surviving the worst situations, but this was something entirely different. This wasn't a fight against an enemy you could see, it wasn't a battle you could win with strength or strategy. This was a war against grief, against trauma, against a world that had become foreign and hostile. I often found myself sitting alone in the quiet moments, reflecting on everything that had happened. I thought about my aunt, about who she had been, and who she could have become had things been different. I thought about the love she had given so freely, the joy she had brought into our lives. And I thought about the man who had taken that from her, the man who had broken her, destroyed her, and ultimately ended her life. I would never be able to forgive him. He had taken her from us, taken her from her children. I couldn't even bring myself to say his name, to acknowledge him as anything but the monster he had become. And yet, in the quiet moments, I wondered if there had been signs, if there had been something I could have done to stop it. But I knew that wasn't the case. There was nothing anyone could have done. Not in the end. I had to focus on my cousins. They needed me, even if they didn't fully understand the depth of what had happened. They were still so young, still trying to process the fact that their mother was gone. They would ask me questions sometimes, questions I didn't know how to answer. Where's Mom? Why did Dad hurt her? Why can't I see her anymore? I didn't have the answers, but I did my best to comfort them. I held them close, tried to shield them from the worst of it, and did my best to create a sense of normalcy in their lives. But there was no normal anymore. The world had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same again. At night, I would lie awake, my mind racing with everything I had to do, how to keep the house running, how to make sure my cousins felt safe, how to manage the grief that weighed so heavily on me. I couldn't allow myself to fall apart. Not yet. They needed me. They needed someone who could hold it all together. But I was breaking. Inside, I was shattered, and there were days when I wasn't sure I could keep going. The memories of my aunt, of the way she had been taken from us, haunted me constantly. And the image of her body, lifeless on the floor, was something I couldn't escape. It had been burned into my mind, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget it. It wasn't just the images, though. It was the loss. The deep, aching loss that felt like a hole in my chest, something that could never be filled. I had lost a part of myself that day. A part of me had died along with her. And I knew that nothing would ever bring that part back. I tried to stay strong for the kids. I tried to make their lives as normal as possible, even though I was barely holding it together myself. I didn't want them to feel my pain, didn't want them to see the cracks that were starting to show in my own facade. But I couldn't help it. I couldn't be the rock they needed all the time. I was only human. As the weeks passed, the support from family and friends began to dwindle. People had their own lives to live, their own families to care for, and while everyone had been there in the beginning, the reality of the situation began to settle in. This wasn't just a temporary thing. This was our life now. This was their life now. And there would be no turning back. I reached out for help. I knew I couldn't do it alone. I wasn't just trying to be a guardian, I was trying to be a parent. I had to figure out how to raise 2 kids who had seen things no child should ever have to see, who had lost both of their parents in a way that was incomprehensible. I couldn't do it without support, without guidance. So, I found a counselor for myself. Someone I could talk to, someone who could help me process the grief, the anger, the guilt. And I made sure the kids had therapy too, even though they were so young. They needed help, even if they didn't fully understand why. It wasn't easy. Nothing about this was easy. But I started to see small changes. The kids began to laugh again, to play, to find moments of joy in their day. It wasn't constant, but it was there. And that gave me hope. If they could start to heal, then maybe, just maybe, I could too. The hardest part, though, was the guilt. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had failed my aunt, that I hadn't done enough to protect her, to stop the abuse before it escalated to this point. I knew it wasn't my fault. I knew I couldn't have prevented what had happened. But that didn't stop the guilt from creeping in, from making me question everything I had done and hadn't done. I would never be able to bring my aunt back. I would never be able to undo what had been done. But I could do this. I could help my cousins find a way forward. I could help them heal, help them create a new life, even though it would never be the same. And that's what I promised myself. I would give them a future, a chance to grow, to be happy despite the pain they had endured.